We have mistranslated the most famous of the Great Commission passages. Most languages do not have a verb to disciple. So translators have had to put in another word to make disciples. But once you put in the word make, you've got to put in a pronoun of the nations. And it totally changes the theology. The only active word in that phrase that Jesus used is to disciple. In going, disciple all nations. We've emphasized the going when Jesus emphasized the discipling.
Patrick, tell us a little bit about your background.
It's hard to know where to start. I'm actually writing the story of Operation World at the moment.
Okay.
And it covers 60 years of service.
Yeah.
And I went out to South Africa. I was one of the first plane missionaries.
Okay.
And my first dear wife, Jill, she was one of the last boat missionaries. That was a transition in 1962. It took 3 days to fly to South Africa from the UK.
Okay.
But I spent 16 years in Africa, and really I started Operation World to help Africans pray for the world. I didn't realize it would go global. But I've had this great privilege of being part of what I feel is one of the greatest movements to Christianity the world has ever seen.
The first edition, Patrick, was only 30 pages in 65 that you brought out.
Yes, in 1965, it was just 30 pages long.
Yeah. Mostly Africa?
No, I did the world.
Okay.
I did about 60 countries of the world in that. Then, after we'd been using it for a few years, the leader of the mission, of which I was part, said, Patrick, you really ought to revise that. And I said, if I revise it, I really ought to do all the other countries in the world I didn't cover.
Yeah.
I did not realize what I was saying.
Okay.
I was in Africa. We had no libraries. We had no internet. Our postal services were cut with most of the world because of sanctions against what was then Rhodesia.
Yeah.
Yet we somehow produced a book.
Very good. And then in 73, you brought out this, almost all the countries with.
Yes, that's right, in 1973. And then we found, to our horror, we printed it on our mission press in Pretoria. And then we found that the South Africans had a law that you could only sell a book in a bookshop if it were printed by trade union members in a print shop. And we'd done it on a mission press. So we had to give the book away.
Yeah.
And we gave a copy to George Verber and to Ralph Winter. And that made it take off. They'd never seen a book like it before. Anyway, I wrote this booklet, and David Barrett got a copy, and we made contact. And I was then producing the next Operation World. We then began to collaborate. We talked a lot about evangelization and how to define it. And I came up with a method of counting evangelicals. And he so liked it that for the 1981 encyclopedia, my method was used. I did a lot of work with him on that for the 1981 edition of the encyclopedia.
Yeah.
But after we published a later edition, the 1993 one, that was just after my dear wife Jill had died of cancer.
Yeah.
And I took a sabbatical. I went over and spent 3 months with Todd and David, and we had a very useful time. So much came out of that sabbatical time, but one thing wasn't so good. David was then very enthused about a different way of counting evangelicals and defining them, which ended up in total failure, really, I think.
No.
He wanted to define evangelicals as those who descended from the Reformation and called them big E evangelicals, and then small e evangelicals were any who thought the Great Commission important. But that small e would then include Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, and most Catholics.
Oh, my goodness.
And so it really made the whole word evangelical meaningless. Anyway, it was used in the 2001 encyclopedia, but fortunately, Todd has backburnered it as not being helpful. But it's interesting that now WEA and Thomas Schirmacher are very keen to have a new effort to assess the theologically defined evangelicals of the world, not those who are politically defined or party-wise defined, but those who would believe the basics that we as evangelicals believe. And so that is being undertaken. And of course, with Thomas being the leader of WEA now, he also translated nearly all the editions of Operation World into German. So he's very much enamored with the Operation World side. Anyway, we had that excellent time and lots came out of it. One was, I said to David, look, we could actually use your people's database, which I'd been working on. I decided I would never develop my own people's database, but I would contribute to those that existed, which at that stage was David's only. So a lot of it was also my input. I said, we can find out all the peoples who are part nomadic or nomadic. And David, who didn't really work with computers himself, said that's impossible. So I went away to his computer and I printed out a list of all the peoples that had nomadic or semi-nomadic components to them. He was astonished. And I took it back to my office in Britain and passed it over to one of my colleagues who worked with me on Operation World. I said, would you be interested in this? He got so interested in it that he wrote the definitive book on nomadic peoples of the world, which he called Peoples on the Move. But I then stood back and I wanted to try to work out how evangelicals had grown or declined because of the way we'd structured the database. And so I used this and all the other information we had to write The Future of the Global Church. Some of you may have it or seen it, but that was my effort to try and understand what present trends 10 years ago might hint about the future. And the first chapter was actually 9 geopolitical things that were happening. One of them was pandemics. I had a section on pandemics. I'd had quite a lot to do with SARS in Hong Kong when it reached there. The leader died with it. So I was very conscious of what pandemics could do. It was almost prophetic about the COVID attack. But then I also wanted to look ahead over the next generation to see how things would work out if present trends continued. Of course, there have been quite a few dramatic changes since then, but I think there's not a lot I would change. One of the things that I would change is the fact that I did a gram on the Muslim world, and I also put a blob or a red blob or an orange blob on each country where there were Muslims, which countries were likely to have warfare and which were likely to have civil unrest because of Islam. It was frightening to see how the whole Muslim world was going to be in turmoil for the next generation.
Which has come
and I
true.
made one mistake about it. I moderated it too much. The violence has been far more than we ever expected. We didn't at that stage know how much the Sahel would be affected by the West trying to get rid of Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, and how the arms have gone all over Africa and caused havoc across the Sahel and beyond.
Patrick, you said something about the trends. You got such a good, vast knowledge of the countries. What trends do you see?
I think one of the privileges, as I look back, that I have had, that I started writing an Operation World just before what I now call the Sixth Awakening. If we look back over evangelical history, there have been 6 events in the Christian world that could be qualified as awakenings. And the first was the Moravian Methodist one. And then the second one was around the time of William Carey, which started the major missions movement outwards. And so we go on until we get to the 5th, which was the Pentecostal Welsh combination at the beginning of the 20th century. But then I began to realize as I was processing all these figures, we were living in a time of extraordinary awakening. It wasn't noticed in the West, so it didn't get the publicity it was due. It started with the charismatic move, and the Jesus movement in the States, the post-independence rush in Africa was a great stimulus to indigenous Christianity. But then what we had from the mid-60s onwards was a 40-year harvest, the like of which the world has never seen.
Yeah.
And because we count evangelicals as the way we have, we could see it in its stark reality. For instance, when I went out to Africa, evangelical Christians were half. In the non-Western world, or as I call it, AFASLA, I don't like the term non-Western, AFASLA, Africa, Asia, Latin America, had half the number of evangelicals that there were in the West in 1960.
Okay.
By the end of the century, it was about 3 times as many evangelicals in the non-Western world as there were in the West. The total shift of the center of gravity of Christianity to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And most people in the West had not perceived this. They'd seen a lot of decline and struggle and not realized this huge harvest. But then we had the 1990s, which was post-communist and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we had that euphoria of that extraordinary decade when we had the greatest harvest ever of that whole 50-year period. But then it all ground to a halt in the early noughties. It was partly Islam with the 9/11 that was being symbolic of this rise. And it immediately then forced evangelical missions to look out for their security and to lower publicity. And so actually missions dropped out of the view of many churches in the West during that time. It was picked up in Asia and Africa and Latin America, as it should. But that was a fact. And then we have the decline of spiritual evangelicalism in the States, which has been devastating. And so really basically, excuse me saying this, Americans, but we're basically seeing America, USA, becoming a post-Constantinian crisis, where the evangelicals think that they can control governments. And it's been devastating for the world. And it's certainly done the evangelical cause great discredit. And so in the future, I don't see the same harvest that we've been having in the past. That awakening has died with that political involvement and with the dissensions that have occurred. What we are seeing in the midst of it all, though, is this astonishing turning to God out of Islam. I did a survey recently with another guy, and we tried to make an assessment of the number of believers from a Muslim background in every country of the world. And my reckoning was that in 1960, there were about 60,000 believers all over the world who'd come to Christ out of Islam. By 2011, when I published The Future of the Global Church, I reckoned it was plus or minus 2 million, but probably 8 to 10 million would become Christian. And one of the major factors causing that was fundamentalist or extremist Islam. The huge disillusionment that swept the Muslim world and the massive flow of migrants. Here comes the thing that you are mentioning, Victor, about the migrants. We've been part of things here in Britain. I wrote a leaflet on the Kurds, pleading with people to go to the Kurds in 1982. And at that time, I could only find evidence for 6 believers amongst all the Kurdish people. In our church here in a small city in Britain, Derby, we had more Kurds who were believers in our church than there were in the whole world 60 years before. And it's just what God has been doing. As I speak with people like Justin Long and people like that who are trying to keep track of what's happening, he reckons that there are probably now 20 million believers who were once Muslim in the world. So in the middle of the decline that we are seeing in many parts, it seems to be now the time for Islam to open up for the gospel.
Which Muslim countries have the maximum amount of movement going?
The first was Indonesia. There are probably 6 million people in Indonesia who are either descendants of or converted out of those who were in Islam. And then the next one that is major is Iran, where at the time of the Ayatollah's revolution in 1978, there were possibly around 400 believers who'd once been Muslim in the whole of Iran.
Yeah.
Today, it's anything between 1.5 million and possibly 2.5 million. And then the other more recent breakthrough is amongst the Kabyle in Algeria, where we reckon that in the midst of the civil war there, up to about 300,000 Kabyle who've become Christian. They've now rediscovered their history, that they were once one of the stronger components of the early Christian church. But the Muslims said they had to have 10 wars against the Kabyle to get rid of Christianity out of them.
What's the situation with Europe?
We are facing a major crisis, just as China and Russia are, with the population implosion. Basically, the harvest we had in the awakening I just mentioned was largely because so many young people and children came to Jesus. But with the massive urbanization that's taking place and the massive increase in the number of refugees, it has crashed the birth rate.
Okay.
And so now the baby boomers of the post-war period are retiring. So suddenly we're running out of people to support the older ones.
Okay.
So China made a full wrong estimate. I won't go into the reasons why, but they made a wrong estimate about the number of people in China. And only recently they've had to admit with the recent census figures that they'd overcounted the population by 100 million.
Whoa.
Which means that by the end of this century, China will have about half its present population. Many countries in Asia have reached the stage where one woman has on average just over one child in her lifetime, which means you must have 2.1 children for every woman on average to maintain a population at a static level. But it's half that. And if you have half that, the population halves every 30 years. And so Europe is going through that stage now. So is Russia and China and many East Asian countries. We're never again going to see the kind of harvest we saw in the 1990s because we're running out of children. We're going to see massive bankruptcies in the States of megachurches because they cannot find enough people to replace those who die or move on. And in many cases, the children are rebelling against the way their parents are behaving. So we're going to have many megachurch disasters in the States in the coming decade. And so we don't have many megachurches in Europe. And most of those that are megachurches are planted by non-Europeans. So generally speaking, Nigerians have been the best church planters in Europe.
Can you tell us what's happening among Hindus and Buddhists and the communists?
Communism is hardly a viable ideology these days. China has adapted communism to have a state capitalism, one might say. And so communism as such is hardly an ideology. And of course, the poor Christians in China are going through a really tough time of persecution. You ask about Hindus and Buddhists. All I can say is that we wanted to print in Operation World the true figures for India as to the number of believers. And I spent quite a time researching and trying to understand the Indian situation. But what a lot of leaders told us, please use the official figures because we want the Hindus to be convinced by their own propaganda. And when the Christians have got big enough in numbers, then we don't mind them finding out. And it was interesting. I had to use the official figures for India, but in the totals for Asia, I put in the more realistic figures. Because basically, with the denominations I was tracking in India, even with all the wildness and chaos of all that's going on, it was many more than the official figures for the number of Christians. And so more is happening than many people realize. It was interesting when Jason produced the 2011 Operation World, they used more realistic figures. Presumably they'd had the permission from you folk in India that it was all right to publish more realistic figures.
The official figure is 2.3%.
But then in Operation World, I think he put in 5.7%.
Yeah, that's an underestimate.
Yes.
Yeah.
As far as Buddhists are concerned, the Buddhist world is so amorphous, it's really very hard to nail it down because it's usually so mixed with other components. Theoretically, Korea is a Buddhist country.
Yeah.
But then we've got the huge church population there. The last I heard was that Korean churches are losing 1 million people every year.
Oh.
So the pool of workers that they were drawing upon to send out missionaries all over is drying up.
Oh.
So there are a lot of factors that cause concern in the Christian church.
Okay.
And I think one of the big things is running out of children.
Yeah. What about China? What are the figures like? What's happening there?
I think one of the best statisticians of China is Paul Hathaway.
Okay.
He's done such meticulous research on every province of China and a remarkable work, a New Zealander. And he has very close relationships with the leaders of the so-called house churches. But the clampdown of Xi in China has been so severe, it's almost now back to Maoism.
Oh.
And I don't know what effect that is going to have on China at the moment. But definitely the Christians are so many that they're not going to be able to stop the gospel. But I don't know how much it's going to limit things. But with the way they have used their technology, especially over the COVID time, the surveillance of the entire population has now become an imminent reality, and a total control of the population by the Communist Party is a real possibility. And unfortunately, that technology has been rapidly exported, especially to countries with a tendency to autocracy. And so we're going to find a huge amount of control on the movement and work of missionaries and Christian leaders in many countries of the world. I have no idea how we are going to combat that and how we're going to see God working in the midst of all that.
Yeah. Patrick, you did some study on urbanization and challenge of urbanization.
Yep. I was privileged to be called by God to Africa to work in cities. We worked in the urban slums of southern Africa, seeking to make disciples of folk there. Very difficult circumstances, but praise God, we had results. I was an early urban missionary. And we've now seen the rapid urbanization that occurred because of globalization is one of the factors. And so by the end of this century, it is reckoned that 90% of everyone on Earth will live in a city. And the largest city in 2050 will be Lagos in Nigeria, with 63 million people. I don't know how a city can survive. And if you've been to Lagos, you'll wonder even more how that city can survive with so many people. But basically, we've got an urban world, and that radically changes Christian ministry. And my contention is that the only ministry that Christians really can see a lot of fruit in is a clear focus on the Great Commission of discipling the nations. In the early days when we worked in rural areas, the missionaries were kings, minor kings. They did the hospitals, schools, everything. The whole economy of the rural areas changed because the missionaries were there. But in cities, foreign missionaries have very limited impact. And the only measure of longevity of ministry is how well you disciple and how well you hand over. And my passion verse is 2 Timothy 2:2. Paul said to Timothy, what you've heard from me before, many witnesses.
Yeah.
Teach to other men, faithful men who will teach others also.
Yeah.
4 generations. How many of us can claim to have got 4 generations following us as disciples?
Yeah.
I wonderfully reached that a few years ago, a 4th generation Christian leader.
Okay.
But basically, I found with my dear African co-workers, it took 10 years.
Okay.
We have these CPMs, the DPMs, the discipling movements and so on. Rapid church growth. In revival, that can happen. But basically, for people to work through their stuff, their burdens, their problems, the baggage they've picked up over life and from previous generations, unless that is dealt with adequately, how can they prepare other leaders? We've got too many narcissists who become Christian leaders because they haven't dealt with their past stuff.
With Muslims, I have only reached 3rd generation, not the 4th yet.
Okay.
When I meet them, I keep asking them, how's your grandchildren doing, your spiritual grandchildren? Patrick, there's a huge house church movement. Did you not monitor house churches separately from the rest of the evangelicals?
No, it's terribly hard to quantify. And so we can only do estimates and try and find out in each country. But we do have a very interesting rule that we use, which I call the 100% rule, that every component of population that is used, let's say a Protestant denomination or all the Christians or all the religions in the country, whatever slice of the population you take, whatever subdivisions within it has to add up to 100%.
Yeah.
And that's a huge discipline. Like in Korea, if we added together all the membership of the 200 or so Presbyterian churches, they'd have about 60% of the population.
Yeah.
But we know it's under 30%. So in other words, many of them are counting people twice or 3 times in different denominations. And so we use that basic rule. And so if we have all the denominations that have given us figures or made estimates that are reasonable for those figures, we can't make the others that would become under the other category more than the total population of Christians.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that's a limiting factor. But in a country like China or India, where a huge proportion of the evangelical Christians are in networks or churches that are very hard to count, we have to rely on a number of indirect methods of measurement. For instance, when Hathaway did the survey of China, he took every district of China and worked out how many churches were there, what they were, what kind of churches they were, and then totaled for the whole country. He's the only one ever to have done that. And in that, he was able to make a really good estimate for the number of so-called house churches.
Okay. Last question, Patrick. What do you think is the future of the global church?
Along with the fragmentation that is taking place politically and with the Cold War type situation, which gave a measure of stability to the world, which we are not going to see again. The kind of thing that the Russians are doing to the Ukrainians is probably going to happen more frequently now, because who's going to stop it? And so we're finding the same in the Christian world. It's increasingly difficult, even with the internet, to maintain close fellowship with a global network. And so there is a degree of fragmentation of the mission movement that is going to take place. And we're going to see, in the middle of the century, Africa taking a far bigger role in the theology and the expansion of Christianity, because they'll be the only youthful continent left. Even India has now reached stability. Every woman, on average, has reached the 2.1 figure. The decline in that figure will go on, and that will mean that from now onwards, the population of India, too, is likely to begin to decrease.
I was going to say, emphasizing Africa, why not 1040 window countries?
The reason I hesitate is because many of those countries are also going through a population implosion for the same reason. Pakistan is a country that might, and also Afghanistan, break the rule, as it were. I put in the Operation World of 2001 two very unexpected and prophetic things. Operation World was printed at the beginning of September 2001. And I put in for the States that the United States is likely to suffer a major terrorist incident. I put it into the text. And a fortnight after its printing, it happened. I also said of Pakistan that the whole world is going to feel the impact of what is taught in the madrasas by Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. It's going to affect the whole world, and it has. And so Pakistan is a hugely unstable country. And by 2050, it's likely to have a population in excess of 400 million. And the Christian minority is really descendants of the Hindu despised untouchables. And so it's not a viable option for most Pakistanis to become a Christian. I think that's going to change, but Pakistan is going to be probably an open wound for the world over the next 40 years. They depend on one river, which they don't fully control. And how is that country going to survive? And so when you ask that question about the 1040 window, which includes North Africa, which is devastated by ISIS, the Arab world, the Christian minority declining, and Pakistan not really responding in big numbers. I mean, in Britain, we've got many Pakistani origin people, but only 400 or so who've come to Jesus over 50 years.
Wow.
And so we haven't seen the breakthrough amongst them, largely because they came from one area in Pakistan, the majority, and they brought their whole society, lock, stock and barrel, to Britain. And it's very hard to break into it. So in response to the 1040 window, there are very few countries there that are going to have a lot of youth who are Christian, new Christian, who are going to do the evangelizing.
Okay. So, Patrick, now we have your 10 minutes to give us a takeaway that people spread from the west coast of America to Japan and Philippines and Germany and Trinidad and South Korea, everywhere there.
Okay. I would lead to what to me is the greatest passion I have. We have mistranslated the most famous of the Great Commission passages. And that's in Matthew 28:19. But we've mistranslated it for one very big reason. Most languages do not have a verb to disciple. The Greeks do. And they can have it either as a noun or a verb. And because we do not have a verb, for instance, if you type in, I am discipling 3 people into Word in English, it'll immediately put a blue wiggly line under it because it's grammatically not correct. And so translators have had to put in another word to make disciples. But once you put in the word make, you've got to put in a pronoun of the nations. And it totally changes the theology. The active word, the only active word in that phrase that Jesus used is to disciple. All the others are infinitives. In-going, disciple all nations. And that's a very different concept than most of us have emphasized. We've emphasized the going, when Jesus emphasized the discipling. In going, in fact, in everything we do, our aim is to transmit to others whatever God has given us. We want to see replication as the basic norm of Christian ministry. And unless we take that to heart, we are going to build empires, we're going to squash future leadership because we want to retain the rule. And we don't have that vision of empowering others that we lead to take our place. As I look to the future, the only hope for a successful growth of the church is to actually return to the words of Jesus, to actually disciple the nations. Now, taking out that word of, it means we also take out the word make in that English translation, and we see another thing. In-going, disciple all nations. In other words, we can aim for and expect that we actually see culture change in nations. The actual nations themselves can change through the impact of the gospel of those who are truly discipled. And I think that's what we need to aim for. It's not a political dominance, but it's an infusion. If you think of what happened, I mean, there's a lot of negatives being said about the British Empire. There were many sad things that happened. But basically, the British Empire was an illogicality because the whole idea of freedom and democratic expression had to come out somewhere. That's why the British Commonwealth still exists. But the basic thing is that in the 19th century, revivals that had such an influence on people that we had a Wilberforce who stopped slavery. We had those who started Sunday schools and schools, improved prisons, set up human rights things. And so nations can be changed by the influence of the gospel. The real hope for the future is for us to grasp this. But my problem with churches today, many churches speak of discipling, but people do not become disciples by going to a Sunday morning service. They become disciples because we live together, we interact with each other. And I was saying to you earlier, Victor, about the fact that really in seeing gangsters, criminals, drug addicts become leaders, it doesn't happen in a year. It takes time. And so we have to be prepared to invest a lot of time and have some serious failures on the way of people who disappoint us. But Jesus was disappointed. The disciples were hardly ready after 3 years with the most wonderful discipler that's ever lived. And so it does take time, and we have to invest in others. And it doesn't fit our sort of power structures that we have tended to build in the Christian world. And so really, my final word to you is, can we actually live the life of a discipler?